Welcome to Anews. I'm Umar Taslim, and you're watching Turkey's Diplomacy. As famine deepens in Gaza and global outrage surges, even Israel's allies are beginning to draw red lines. A major United Nations conference is moving forward without the United States or Israel. The UK has threatened to recognize Palestine, and Israeli ministers are facing new bans and sanctions from the West. Today, we'll discuss the growing diplomatic rifts, genocide allegations from within Israel, and the country's efforts to sway global opinion after killing over 60,000 innocent civilians in the occupied Gaza Strip.
British Prime Minister Keir Starmer on Tuesday said his government planned to recognize a Palestinian state in September at the United Nations General Assembly, unless Israel takes a number of steps to improve life for Palestinians.
Our goal remains a safe and secure Israel, alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state.
Israel's foreign ministry said it rejected Starmer's statement. The support for Palestinian statehood reflects Israel's deepening isolation over its conduct in its war against Hamas in Gaza. The death toll in the war-ravaged enclave has crossed 60,000, according to the Gaza Health Ministry, where a humanitarian disaster has set in. Amid warnings from international aid agencies that people in Gaza are facing starvation, a growing number of lawmakers in Starmer's Labour Party have been asking him to recognize a Palestinian state to raise pressure on Israel. Britain, if it acts, would follow a similar move by France last week and become the second Western power on the UN Security Council to do so. French President Emmanuel Macron said on Thursday France would recognize Palestine as a state in territories Israel captured in the 1967 Middle East War. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu condemned Macron's decision, as did U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio.
So today, as part of this process towards peace, I can confirm the UK will recognise the State of Palestine by the United Nations General Assembly in September, unless the Israeli government takes substantive steps to end the appalling situation in Gaza, agree to a ceasefire, and commit to a long-term sustainable peace, reviving the prospect of a two-state solution. And this includes allowing the UN to restart the supply of aid and making clear that there will be no annexations in the West Bank.
Welcome back to the program. Anews editor Mustafa Kojakanar. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Omar.
Mustafa, let's start with the UN conference that's underway in New York. Saudi Arabia and France are co-chairing this conference on Palestine. Now, let me read some statements from the UN Secretary General and the French Foreign Minister. Guterres says we are at a breaking point and that the two-state solution is farther than ever before. The French Foreign Affairs Minister has said that they will recognize the state of Palestine to bolster those Palestinians who chose nonviolence. Now, Mustafa, let's start with this conference. Tell me more about this conference. Who's attending it? Israel and the United States have obviously rejected the statements coming from the conference. Tell me more about this, Mustafa.
Omar, as you know, in recent times, we have been always talking about coercive measures against Israel over the deteriorating human rights issues in the occupied Gaza Strip. And right now, we are seeing that pro-Palestinian movement is gaining momentum worldwide. And within this context, right now, United Nations is hosting a peace conference for Palestine, initiated by Saudi Arabia and France. Many nations, including Turkey, are right now participating in the UN conference over Palestine. As you know, last week, French President Emmanuel Macron announced his government's decision to recognize Palestinian statehood in the United Nations General Assembly meeting in September. And it is projected that France France decision will trigger a domino effect among Western countries. Within this context, as far as I know, Canada is also planning to recognize the legitimate rights of Palestinian people living in the Middle East. On the other hand, yesterday, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer also announced that the United Kingdom is preparing to recognize the Palestinian state in September unless Israel takes a decision over ceasefire in Gaza. And it is clearly showing that Israel is being diplomatically isolated from the Western countries. We know that Western countries are complicit in Israel's war crimes and crimes against humanity. But right now, the international community is shifting its foreign policy goals towards decades-old conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. We know that Israel has been enjoying close relationships with Western countries in all fields, ranging from politics and economy, trade and military. And right now, they are still hesitating to call what happens in Gaza as a genocide. But it is clearly showing that Western countries are starting to take concrete steps against Israel in terms of convincing the Israeli decision makers of halting their military offensive in Gaza. Yesterday, Prime Minister Keir Starmer also clearly stated that the United Kingdom is against the annexation of West Bank by the Israeli decision makers, because we know that some far-right figures within Israel's embattled Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's war cabinet is pushing for the annexation of the West Bank. And it is clearly showing that Western countries are taking right steps against Israel. On the other hand, as you know, Turkey is also participating in the UN conference initiated by Saudi Arabia and France. Turkish Deputy Foreign Minister Nuh Yilmaz reiterated Turkey's strong support for the Palestinian statehood based on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. And it is also clearly showing that Turkey's diplomatic initiatives in terms of increasing international awareness about the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people living in the Middle East are yielding positive results in terms of recognition of the Palestinian state. I think that the Western countries will take new steps to recognize the Palestinian statehood, and I think that it will push the Israeli decision makers to come to the negotiating table and strike a ceasefire deal with Hamas in foreseeable future.
Musa, but there are double standards here, because the United States, on one hand, it says, we saw Trump's statements from last night, he said that there is real starvation, children are dying of hunger. But then the United States has also said that this is a publicity stunt by the United Nations and this only emboldens Hamas. So why is the United States making such statements at this point?
Umar, since October 7, 2023, Israeli decision makers have been committing crimes against humanity and war crimes in the occupied Gaza Strip. And we know that the United States is always reaffirming its strong support for Israel's so-called national security demands in the region. During the Biden administration, United States also supported Israel's military activities in the Gaza Strip. But on the other hand, many officials from the Biden administration also criticized Israel's military actions. But during Trump administration, we know that United States ironclad support for Israel is on the ground. And we know that U.S. President Donald Trump welcomed Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu several times to the White House this year to discuss the bilateral relationships between Washington and Tel Aviv and exchange views on the regional developments in the Middle East. We know that the United States is still supplying ammunition and weapons to Israel to continue its military activities across the region. I think that Netanyahu is feeling to be strengthened by Trump administration's unwavering support for Israel. On the other hand, as you know, Israel is denying the accusation about starvation policies in Gaza, and Benjamin Netanyahu is accusing the international community of exacerbating the humanitarian situation in Gaza. But we know that people right now are being starved to death by the Israeli security forces. But I am still struggling to understand Trump's foreign policy goals toward the Palestinian and Israeli conflict. But yesterday, Trump made an announcement about the starvation and malnutrition crisis in the Gaza Strip. He publicly contradicted Netanyahu's claims about the starvation crisis in Gaza, and he is calling upon the international community to accelerate the humanitarian efforts to feed the war-weary Palestinian people living in the war-torn Gaza Strip. As you know, at the end of May, United States and Israel initiated so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, but we know that Israeli security forces are still taking aim at Palestinians waiting for the humanitarian aid packages, which is supposed to be delivered by the so-called GHF, and it is clearly showing that Israel is still turning a blind eye to international criticism over the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. I think that the regional and international stakeholders, if these stakeholders increase their diplomatic, economic and military pressure on Israel, we will witness prosperity and stability in the Middle East. I think that coercive measures are needed for Israel, and coercive measures can include economic sanctions, arms embargo, and cutting military ties with Israel. As you know, Turkey has already halted its trade activities with Israel. Turkey is always calling upon the international community to increase pressure on Israel over the humanitarian situation in Gaza. I think that regional and international stakeholders will find a common way or common sense, and the Palestinian people will live in their homeland with dignity and peace.
Musa, tell me about Germany's stance right now, because Chancellor Merz has said that recognizing the state of Palestine is not the initial step. It could be a final step in the two-state solution. So why is Germany still, backtracking from its earlier decisions, earlier statements that we will recognize Palestine, we will work hard for the Palestinians, we will provide them humanitarian aid because of the catastrophe over there, which is obviously initiated by Israel. So why is Germany still struggling to come to terms over what is happening in the occupied Gaza Strip?
We know that Germany is one of the most important countries supporting Israel's military activities in the region, and German decision makers are always reaffirming the German government's unwavering support for Israel's so-called national security demands in the region. And German Chancellor Friedrich Merz is still hesitating to use genocide term for what is happening in Gaza right now. But I think that Germany is suffering from the historical realities on the ground, and they are hesitating to criticize Israel's military activities. I think that France's and United Kingdom's decisions will trigger a domino effect among Western countries, and these countries will be first nations within G7 countries to recognize the independence of the Palestinian state. I think that Germany will be supposed to follow France and United Kingdom's path if they want to see long-standing peace and tranquility in the Middle East, because we know that if there is something wrong in the Middle East, it will spread the chaos to the other parts of the world, and it will pose a huge threat to international peace and security. I think that German decision makers will be aware of this situation, and I think that they will be in the right side of the history.
Musa, we've seen the dangers and the horrors of the war as well. We saw the Holocaust, we've seen those images, and now when we see what's happening in the occupied Gaza Strip, don't you think this is worse?
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan yesterday also compared what's happening in Gaza right now to the Nazi atrocities against Jewish people. I think that we cannot compare the pains, but right now the Palestinians are still suffering from Israel's military activities. In the last 2 years, Israeli security forces have been murdering more than 60,000 Palestinians living in the occupied Gaza Strip. Strip, and most of them are children and women. And it is clearly showing that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinian people living in the occupied Gaza Strip. We know that Germany under Nazi administration also committed genocide against the Jewish people. I don't think that we have to compare these historical issues to each other, because both of them are genocide, and these actions should be held accountable in front of the international law and history. I think that Turkey has been one of the most important countries in terms of increasing international awareness about Israel's genocidal acts and ethnic cleansing policies in the Gaza Strip. Turkey has been doing everything to bring Israel to the International Court of Justice to face the accusations against this Middle Eastern country. As you know, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan have been in close contact with their counterparts from all around the world to discuss what can be done in terms of halting Israel's military activities and bringing peace and tranquility to the region. I think that Turkey will continue to be at the diplomatic forefront to hold Israel accountable for its war crimes and crimes against humanity in the Gaza Strip.
Mustafa, the international organizations we've seen over the last few months, over the past few years, that international organizations have failed to exercise their duties. They have failed to stop conflicts. And we've been seeing how organizations like the UN, like the Red Cross, like the International Red Cross, they have been blocked by the Israeli government from providing aid, from exercising their duties in these war-torn areas. Now, what they're not wrong on are the facts, are the statistics. Now, around 50 to 60 trucks are being allowed into the occupied Gaza Strip, right? But the United Nations says that around 500 to 600 trucks are needed daily. And this is not the conditions, the requirements are not being met. Around 90% of the population in the occupied Gaza Strip is suffering from starvation. Children are dying on a daily basis. Now, tell me about aid. The UAE and Jordan, we've been seeing over the past few days, they've been airdropping aid into the occupied Gaza Strip, but that's still not enough. What needs to be done at this point, and how important do you think is the GHF's role right now, or is it not important at all? Because we've been seeing how people are lining up in queues and then they're being shot at. So what's your analysis around the humanitarian assistance that's being provided right now?
Right now, starvation and malnutrition crises are gripping the Gaza Strip, and Palestinian people are waiting for the international aid packages to feed themselves and their children. And as we mentioned, GHF was initiated by the United States and Israel at the end of May. And the GHF is not only distributing humanitarian aid packages, it is also targeting Palestinian people waiting for the humanitarian aid packages. On the other hand, Israel, as you know, decided to impose a pause of its military activities in the Gaza Strip over the increasing international criticism over its military activities in the region. And right now, United Nations is also criticizing Israel of obstructing any humanitarian aid operations in the Gaza Strip. Right now, many aid groups and humanitarian rights activists are accusing Israel of obstructing humanitarian operations in the occupied Gaza Strip. And we know that international community is supposed to increase its diplomatic or political pressure over Israel because we know that people are right now being starved to death by the Israeli security forces. On the other hand, Turkey has been always accusing United Nations of failing to promise delivering its promises over the security situation in the Gaza Strip. As you know, 5 permanent members are controlling the United Nations Security Council right now, and these countries are the United States, the United Kingdom, China, Russia, and France. And as we know that United States vetoed many resolutions about the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, and if one of these nations veto any international resolutions, United Nations is being obstructed to take any concrete steps to deal with the international security challenges. And that is the reason why Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is reiterating at every opportunity that the world is bigger than five. And Turkey has been always calling for reform within the United Nations Security Council. We know that UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is always praising Turkey's diplomatic efforts in terms of increasing international awareness about the reform process within the UNSC. On the other hand, many other countries are also reiterating their strong support for reform efforts for the United Nations Security Council. But I think that permanent members within the UNSC will be opposing to reform efforts for the United Nations. But Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has been always saying that a fairer world will be possible if the United Nations take actions in terms of reaffirming itself. I think that this September, many Western and Eastern countries will gather in New York to discuss the regional and international security challenges. I think that on the sidelines of the United Nations, regional and international stakeholders will find a common way or common sense in terms of reforming the UN Security Council. And I think that if the UN will be able to reform itself, we will see more peace and tranquility around the world.
Mustafa, thanks for that analysis. We'll be right back with you.
You're welcome.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan made some important statements last night. Let's listen to that and we'll be right back.
Terör devleti İsrail 22 aydır Filistin halkını canice katlediyor. 360 kilometre kareye hapsettiği Gazze'li kardeşlerimize soykırım uyguluyor. Gazze'den Nazi kamplarından çok daha kötü, daha vahşi ve insanlık dışı fotoğraflar geliyor. Tüm dünyanın gözleri önünde bir halk açlık ve susuzlukla öldürülüyor. Gazze'deki insani durum felaket boyutundadır. Masum çocuklar ya açlıktan ya da İsrail işgal güçlerinin silahlarından çıkan kurşunlardan dolayı can vermektedir. İsrail'in açlığı özellikle Filistinlilere karşı bir silah olarak kullanması, bunların insanlıktan nasibini almadıklarının en açık göstergesidir. Bu barbarlık karşısında İslam ülkeleri başta olmak üzere herkesin vicdan sahibi tüm ülkelerin, tüm halkların sesini daha fazla yükseltmesi şarttır. Biz bu konuda ne yapılması gerekiyorsa yapmaya devam edeceğiz. Gazze halkına soykırım uygulayanların hukuk ve tarih önünde hesap verdiği günleri de İnşallah göreceğiz.
Welcome back to the program. Now let's take a look at the front page of Daily Sabah. Mustafa, around 60,000 people have now been killed in Israel's genocidal war. And now the most important thing is that right groups inside Israel, within Israel, Israeli rights groups, have criticized Benjamin Netanyahu's policies and have called the war in the occupied Gaza Strip a genocide. Tell me more about that.
Mar, as we mentioned, right now, pro-Palestinian movement is gaining momentum worldwide. But on the other hand, we know that domestic pressure is also mounting on Israel's embattled Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his war cabinet. Some Israeli human rights groups this week accused Israel of committing a genocide against Palestinian people living in the Gaza Strip. And it is clearly showing that Israeli public opinion is not also supporting Netanyahu's war cabinet's policies in the Gaza Strip. Right now, as you know, Israelis have been taking to the streets every weekend to express their frustration over Netanyahu and his war cabinet. On the other hand, we know that Israelis are calling Netanyahu crime minister instead of prime minister, because we know that there is still ongoing corruption trial against Netanyahu. And within this domestic political structure within Israel, I think that Netanyahu believes that the continued military operations across the Middle East are the best options for him to keep himself politically alive. But I don't think that Netanyahu will politically survive for good, and the international criticism and domestic pressure will yield positive results in terms of putting an end to the Netanyahu regime in Israel. And I think that Israeli public opinion will continue to increase their pressure on their government, and it will pave the way for the ceasefire agreement between Hamas and Israel.
Mustafa, also as we can see, the Kazakh president Tokayev was in Ankara yesterday. That's outside the presidential building in Ankara. What was on the agenda, Mustafa, when Tokayev met President Erdogan yesterday?
Umar, as you mentioned yesterday, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan welcomed his Kazakh counterpart Kasım Jomart Tokayev to the Turkey's capital Ankara, and Erdogan and Tokayev discussed all aspects of bilateral political, cultural, military and economic cooperation between their countries, exchanging views on the latest regional and international security challenges. And following their meeting, both Erdogan and Tokayev oversaw the signing of dozens of agreements in terms of strengthening the bilateral cooperation between Turkey and Kazakhstan. We know that Turkey has been always enjoying close relationships with Turkic countries in the Central Asia, and Kazakhstan is one of them. And yesterday, President Erdogan also mentioned about the legitimate rights of the Turkish Cypriot people living on the Cyprus island. Turkey has been always calling upon Turkic states to take concrete steps in terms of recognizing the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus as a state. Right now in the world politics, no one except Turkey is recognizing the legitimate rights of the Turkish Cypriot people and Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. As you know, this year some Turkic states unfortunately took diplomatic steps to normalize their bilateral ties with the Greek Cypriot administration, and they appointed their ambassadors to this Greek Cypriot administration. And it is, I think, poisoning the bilateral relationships between Turkey and Turkic states. As you know, in the coming months, there will be a summit between Turkic states, will be organized by the Organization of Turkic States. I think that Turkey will continue to take new diplomatic actions in terms of convincing these countries of recognizing the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. I think that Tokayev's latest visit to Turkey will yield positive results for ensuring long-standing peace and tranquility in the wider Eurasia region.
Mustafa, thanks for giving us the latest updates from the top stories from Daily Sabah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark.
Now let's take a look at this news report, and we'll be right back.
This box of provisions fell from the sky over Gaza and is meant to feed Amal Abu Asi's family. It's a humiliation, the mother of three says, and not enough. Her children are hungry and unhealthy and can't remember eggs, meat and fruit. The IPC Hunger Monitor said on Tuesday famine is unfolding in Gaza, where Israel has placed severe restrictions on aid. Faced with a mounting international outcry, Israel on Sunday announced humanitarian pauses in its military campaign and assistance for those wanting to conduct airdrops. But aid groups say airdrops are ineffective, costly and tokenistic. Abu Asi wants aid to come in as it used to, via trucks through the border.
This package isn't even worth us running after it and dying for. They fall on people's tents, their homes. People fight each other, hold knives. It's just not worth it. If it was, we'd say yes, drop them. But no, we're against this. I speak for myself and the whole Gaza Strip.
Gaza health authorities have been reporting more people dying from hunger-related causes. The total stood at 147 on Tuesday, among them 88 children, most of whom died in the last few weeks. This was Samar Abdul-Jabbar, of the UN's World Food Programme.
Especially now, we're talking about catastrophic levels of needs. So the only way to bring in scale is actually the use of the land crossings.
The airdrops can also be dangerous, as Mohammed Abulainain found at his home in Gaza City.
What happened is that the parachute fell on the roof. It damaged the roof. People attacked the house. This is not the way to distribute aid. The old way was we would receive a text message to get an aid coupon. People attacked us for the sake of an aid parcel. People are hungry.
Faris Zahir's kids watch him unpack another box. It's not enough for a family of 8, he says, but the alternatives are fraught with danger. The UN estimates that Israeli forces have killed more than 1,000 people seeking food supplies, most of them near the militarized distribution sites of the US and Israeli-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, or GHF. The GHF says it has distributed over 96 million meals since late May. We want something safer for us and our children, Zahir says. The IPC alert raised the prospect that the man-made starvation crisis in Gaza could be formally classified as a famine, and that could pressure Israel to let in more food. Gaza hit another grim milestone on Tuesday, as the death toll from the conflict with Israel passed 60,000 people, according to the enclave's health authorities. Palestinian officials and rescue workers believe thousands more bodies are buried under the rubble.
Welcome back to the program. Joining us now from the Pakistani capital is Javed Rana. Javed, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Umar.
Javed, let's firstly start with the decision that was made by the Dutch government. Now it has decided to ban Bezalel Smotrich, who is the finance minister, and the national security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir. They have been banned from entering the Netherlands. Earlier, we were talking how Europe has not acted appropriately on the war in Gaza, but now Europe is starting to take actions.
I think it's too late and too late. Nonetheless, something is better than nothing, because that should have come long ago. Anyway, I think since there have been repeated protests, frequent protests across Europe, despite the fact that many of the organizations who were holding and organizing these protests, they were banned, essentially, which means that pro-Palestinian protests were banned by and large in Europe, particularly in Germany. And nonetheless, I think the protesters, the public's sentiments have made their presence felt now within the corridors of the power. That is why we have seen that some voices of sanity. But again, we have to understand this, the finance minister, he was the one not long ago, he had threatened Gaza to carry out nuclear attack. Again, this should have come at that particular point of time. No, anyway, what is done, that's a gone and dead story. On a broader scale, I think now it looks like that the European countries are looking for some kind of face-saving. That is why we have seen that France is saying that it's going to recognize state of Palestine by September. UK has threatened Israel that it would recognize state of Palestine if there is no ceasefire agreement. And then I think so many other countries, European and other countries, they have already recognized, most of the countries in the world, they have already recognized the state of the Palestine. And they're, symbolically speaking, their envoys, their ambassadors have been into these countries. But again, the bigger picture is that since they don't have a state on the ground, that is a bigger challenge. Now, every movement inside UN Security Council has been blocked by the United States, and also partially by these European countries. Sometimes they will register their absence. Sometimes they would also veto any resolution for the two-state solution or any resolution calling for the ceasefire agreement in the past. Nonetheless, now they're trying to compensate because of the public pressure. And it looks like that the real problem lies with the Germany, because Germany has been very forthcoming in supporting state of Israel in every aspect. And apart from Germany, it is the USA, and more particularly, it is the two governments of the Donald Trump. because they have gone to a tipping point in their sport. First, they recognized Golan Heights, and then they also recognized Jerusalem as the capital of the apartheid of state of Israel. And then he went for a so-called Abraham Accord, which means normalizing diplomatic ties with the apartheid state on the terms and the condition that Netanyahu has been laying down. So again, that encouraged Israel to commit more aggression on Palestinian people, and that also created hostile conditions for the jihadi groups, resistant groups in Palestine, and they carried out a military operation on October 7, 2023. So again, in that broader context, now something is moving, something is now shaking. The net benefit, obviously, we have seen that 50 to 60 trucks of the aid, they are now pouring into the Gaza every day, despite the fact that that this should have been, at least there should have been 500 to 600 trucks, which should be there every day.
Javed, tell me about the British decision now. Keir Starmer has said that the UK will recognize the state of Palestine in September, but obviously there are some conditions. It has asked Israel to initiate a ceasefire, not to annex the West Bank, and to provide more humanitarian aid to the Gazans. Do you think this is because of public pressure in the United Kingdom? Because the mood has changed excessively over the past few months.
Certainly, because in the United Kingdom, many pro-Palestinian groups have been banned, and there have been police crackdown on the peaceful Palestinian protesters. Now there seems to be a change of heart, but again, we are seeing more that in political rhetorics. Now he's just saying that the British is going to recognize state of Palestine, which means obviously symbolically, but that unless there is a ceasefire agreement, that means it is some kind of a pressure on the apartheid state to go for an immediate ceasefire agreement with the Hamas. I think that is not happening. Now these two far-right political parties, I would call them extremist political parties, they've been pressurizing Netanyahu to annex parts of Gaza, at least to begin with, because in fact they want the entire Gaza to be annexed. And then the West Bank. West Bank is far more important from religious point of view for the Zionists than that of Gaza. So again, I think what we need to see that if this ceasefire agreement is a permanent, if this ceasefire agreement means withdrawal of the Israeli forces from Gaza, that means it is something meaningful. But if this ceasefire agreement is just for the 60 days, that would obviously mean that it will be just a lease of life for the Palestinian people for the 60 days. But bigger question is that how the Muslim countries are going to react. We have seen good sound bites from the President Tayyip Erdogan. It looks like that he is going to undertake some kind of initiative where the Muslim country is going to be reactivated, because this is the time when the Europeans are active. This is the time when Donald Trump himself seems to be under pressure. Now, it is a very rare that he said that there is a starvation in Gaza. He is admitting it, but at the same time, in a very hypocritical manner, that it is he's saying that it is only USA which is providing 60 million aid. The bigger fact of the matter is that there are hundreds of trucks of the aid. The common people, the NGOs from Muslim countries, they are willing to go inside Gaza, but they are being blocked. The bigger problem is the apartheid state of Israel, which the Donald Trump has been supporting. So again, I think this is the high time that the Muslim countries call for OIC summit, and then they build up a pressure on Europe. They build up a pressure more particularly on Washington to bring an end to this genocide.
Political analyst Javed Rana, thank you for that analysis. It was a pleasure having you on the program. Anews editor Mustafa Kocakinar, thank you for being with us in the studio.
Thank you very much.
That brings us to the end of our program. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.